Used to be, all you needed to keep them dogies rolling was a good horse and a broke-in saddle. You didn't have to worry about cows getting in the creek or kicking up a little dust. But times have changed, and producing quality beef is a bit more complicated than it used to be. Environmental regulations, permits, urban sprawl, complaints, lawsuits, and special interest groups have all changed the way we do business. The EPA and individual states are focusing more attention now on agriculture, and it's become more important than ever for beef and dairy producers to keep pace with environmental rules and issues that affect our industry. By taking a proactive approach, dairymen and feeders can stay ahead of potential problems as new laws and regulations are written. It's a smart way to do business. It keeps us out of trouble with the regulators and provides a positive image for our industries. So, let's get this cattle drive going. First off, what are the environmental regulations and issues that directly affect feedlots and dairies?
Let's start by identifying the three main types of cattle operations. 1. Grazing operations. 2. Animal feeding operations, or AFOs for short. And 3. Larger concentrated animal feeding operations, which are referred to as CAFOs.
3 types of operations, and the EPA looks at them 3 different ways.
Pastures, stubble fields, and rangeland where cattle are grazed, not confined, are not considered animal feeding operations and are not regulated except in a few cases. Animal feeding operations, or AFOs, must confine animals for at least 45 days a year in pens that have no significant vegetation growing. Operations like these are regulated in some states, but are only regulated by the EPA when EPA designates them as a CAFO. That's the third group, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations, or CAFOs. The EPA considers any operation a CAFO if it has the capacity to confine at least 1,000 head of feeder cattle or 700 mature dairy cows. EPA also considers smaller operations to be CAFOs if they confine at least 300 head of beef cattle or 200 dairy cattle and discharge runoff through a man-made structure or allow fresh water to run through pens. States can also designate an operation as a CAFO if it is found to be causing water pollution, even if it has much less than the 1,000 head capacity. Let's run through it again. Grazing operations on pasture, stubble, and rangeland are not regulated by the EPA except in a few special cases. Smaller confinement operations that are below 300 head of beef cattle or 200 dairy cows are sometimes regulated by individual states, but not by EPA unless they are specifically found to be causing water pollution. Finally, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs, include operations with capacities of 1,000 beef cattle and smaller operations with more than 300 beef cattle or 200 dairy cattle that discharge pollutants from pens. Either way, CAFOs are always regulated.
So how are these rules enforced?
The Environmental Protection Agency has the authority to regulate all CAFOs, but in most cases, they delegate their regulatory authority to individual states. The states then administer their own livestock permit programs, and most cattlemen prefer it that way.
They like having face-to-face interaction with regulators? No, really, they like having face-to-face interaction with regulators. It helps to look someone in the eye.
States are also allowed to create environmental rules that are more strict than EPA regulations, but not less. That's why in some states, a producer that preconditions 200 calves in a pen for 45 days can be considered a CAFO.
It's a fact in the cattle business, manure happens. A lot of manure happens, and that can be a good thing when it's used as fertilizer.
Or it can be a problem when rain or snowmelt carries it into waterways, where it can cause fish kills or contaminate drinking water supplies. Manure runoff can also percolate downward through soil layers. In this video, we'll focus on the rules and management practices that affect CAFOs. But regardless of the size of your operation, proper management of manure and wastewater is based on 3 key elements: storage, handling, and application.
Let's take a minute and try and get a hold of this manure management issue, so to speak. First, there's storage. Did you ever in your wildest dreams figured you'd be spending so much time trying to find the right way to handle manure? Politicians and cattlemen, two professions with the same problem.
Whether you stockpile manure inside your pens or in other areas of your facility, all runoff from manure storage areas need to be caught in an approved runoff storage structure, like a lagoon, settling basin, or concrete pit. In fact, the regulations for CAFOs require that all stormwater runoff is caught and stored if it comes in contact with manure and urine. That includes runoff from uncovered pens, alleys, and loading areas. Even runoff from certain feed storage areas, like silage pits, need to be captured in a lagoon. Take some time to look around your facility and think about which way the water runs when it rains. Does it all ultimately drain to the lagoons or somewhere else? If you answered somewhere else, you may need to install some drainage ditches or build diversion dikes to prevent runoff from running off-site. Runoff water from rain or snowmelt picks up manure and soil as it moves downhill. It's a good idea to catch these solids before they enter your lagoon system. This helps prevent sludge buildup in the bottom of the lagoons, so they don't need to be cleaned as often. A settling basin catches storm water before it enters the lagoon and holds it long enough to let solids settle to the bottom. Solid separators screen solid materials out of the liquid stream by using gravity or mechanical means. Separator units can be stationary or portable depending on the need. Separated solids can be composted or transported to fields for land application. Whether you use a settling basin or ditch or a mechanical separator, the name of the game is to preserve as much storage capacity in your lagoon system as possible. Wastewater storage structures must be lined on the bottom and sides to meet regulatory requirements for seepage control. So when it is time to clean the sludge out, be careful not to disturb the liner. CAFOs must maintain at least enough lagoon storage capacity to hold the runoff generated by a 25-year, 24-hour storm, and some states require even more storage capacity be maintained.
However, if you're going to build a feedlot in Death Valley, you'll probably be okay.
If solids are not removed before they enter the lagoon, additional lagoon capacity is needed to allow for sludge buildup, which slowly reduces a lagoon storage space over time. Lagoon storage systems must also hold a certain amount of process-generated wastewater. Process water is just what the name implies: wastewater that is generated through some process, such as washing down chutes, processing areas, milking parlors, rinsing out bulk milk tanks and lines, and blowdown water from feed mills. The amount of lagoon storage required for process-generated wastewater varies by state, but it can be as much as the total amount generated in 6 months or more. So, at a minimum, your runoff and wastewater storage system needs to be able to hold the 25-year storm amount or more depending on the state, plus the process-generated wastewater amount, which also varies by state, plus additional room for sludge buildup if solids are not separated out.
That's already a pretty big swimming pool for ducks.
But regulations also require CAFOs to keep the water level in the lagoon a couple of feet below the top of the dam. This unused area is called freeboard, and it serves as a safety cushion to help prevent lagoon overflow during extremely rainy periods. If a major storm does occur, the lagoon has to be pumped back down to hold another 25-year storm within a fairly short period of time, usually around 2 weeks. You'll also want to keep written records of the water level in your lagoons.
Now you'll need a way to measure the lagoon's depth. You might try a tape measure, or maybe you can get one of the boys to put on a pair of goggles and a set of flippers.
But a better idea is to install a permanent metal or fiberglass measuring gauge. A lagoon depth gauge should be clearly marked at 1 foot intervals. Some have the marks in different colors to make them easier to read. And some lagoon markers are even more creative.
In this case, if the operator can't see the chicken, it's time to pump the lagoon.
Obviously, lagoons and manure pits can be a safety hazard, so it's a good idea to keep them fenced in to restrict access. Be sure to inspect the pumps, motors, and piping on a regular basis to make sure they're in good working order. And keep the grass around your lagoons mowed short to minimize habitat for flies and rodents and to prevent trees from growing.
Well, I think we've covered the storage part, so that leaves us with the remaining two key elements, manure and lagoon water handling and application. You can save yourself some headaches if you use care when handling and applying manure. I don't know about you, but I'm always plenty careful when I handle manure, if you get my drift.
First off, to avoid spillage or runoff, don't overload trucks and spreaders. When you haul manure, be sure to keep track of 4 things: the amount hauled, where it was taken, the date, and the driver's name. Also, if you're spreading the manure on fields, write down the field number too, so you can keep track of how much was applied. We'll discuss why in just a minute. We all know that manure and lagoon water are great fertilizers. Both are loaded with nitrogen, phosphorus, and other valuable nutrients that crops can use. But crops can only use so much so fast. Any unused nutrients can be a problem, especially if they make their way into streams and lakes or into groundwater. So you'll need to match the amount of manure you apply with the nutrient needs of the crop you're growing. This is called the agronomic rate. To figure out how to apply manure or lagoon water at the agronomic rate, you need to know the fertilizer needs of the crop based on a reasonable yield goal. You also need to know the amount of nutrients that are already present in the soil. Finally, you need to know the amount of nutrients that are in the manure or lagoon water so you can determine how much of each you can apply. To obtain a nutrient analysis for soil, manure, and lagoon water, you'll need to collect samples of each and have them tested by a certified lab. Based on the test results, the lab will provide an estimate of the amount of each you should apply. Applications of manure or wastewater should be timed to avoid runoff, and don't apply when the ground is saturated or when heavy rain or snowfall is expected. Use a crop rotation that will allow greater flexibility of timing and rates of manure. New regulations are requiring that nitrogen and phosphorus are not over-applied on land application areas. So it's a good idea to plan what crops will grow a couple of years ahead to make sure soil nutrient levels, especially phosphorus, don't get so high that you can't apply on a field. When it comes to manure, you want to make sure your operation is covered, so to speak.
It's all right to get it on your boots, just don't track it in the house.
Good record keeping is your best protection against fines and penalties. And starting a record-keeping program right now makes it easier to develop a comprehensive nutrient management plan later. And that is why it's important to keep track of how much manure or lagoon water you put on each field, as well as any commercial fertilizer. If it all sounds too confusing, ask your county extension agent or a crop consultant for assistance in getting started, because there are a couple of other nuances like manure mineralization rates and nitrogen volatilization that need to be figured into the equation. One last note about manure. If limited land application acreage is a problem, composting might be a solution. Composting reduces the volume and weight of manure and converts it into an odorless, fine-textured product that makes an excellent fertilizer and soil enhancement. The composting process kills disease-causing organisms and most weed seeds and stabilizes the nutrients so they are released slowly to plants. Finished compost can be sold or applied on fields to improve the soil quality.
Now, while the aroma of your cattle feeding operation or your dairy may have the sweet smell of success to you, you may rest assured that not all your neighbors share your enthusiasm for the odors of the cattle business. And every day, more and more people are building homes in the country, and some of these folks seem to have rather delicate noses. They might not also appreciate the dust that sometimes gets churned up by your fine critters, or the flies swarming around the one or two that just didn't make it.
With so many more folks moving within close proximity to commercial livestock operations, the chance of complaints increases, which can lead to a visit from your local health department or state official. Dealing with complaints is time-consuming and potentially expensive, so a little planning now can save a lot of hassle later. A written nuisance management plan may be your best way to combat complaints. A nuisance management plan is just a series of strategies written down on paper that you use to minimize nuisance conditions, both day-to-day and during severe conditions. Your nuisance management plan should be tailored to your site. It should describe the different procedures used to control nuisance conditions. For example, Your plan may include restricting pen cleaning activities and manure application to the morning hours whenever possible in order to take advantage of lighter winds and rising air. Include categories for how you manage odors, dust, insects, rodents, and mortalities. And depending on your operation, you may also want to include noise and traffic minimization plans. Update your plan when you make changes to the operation or use new nuisance management methods. These tiny parasitic wasps are being used to control flies. A nuisance management plan is just good business. It's proactive, pro-neighbor, and professional. But there are also some bottom-line advantages to aggressive management of nuisance issues. Excessive dust, for example, depresses feed intake and increases respiratory illness rates in cattle. Odor emissions also carry chemical compounds, such as ammonia, that can harm the respiratory system. And heavy fly infestations distract cattle from eating, causing reduced gain. Along with your nuisance plan, you should have an emergency management plan that describes how you will manage environmental issues during a crisis. All the planning in the world isn't of any value unless the plan is followed. Whether it's nuisance or emergency management, all employees should be familiar with the plans and should be encouraged to ask questions and offer suggestions for improvement.
And speaking of management programs, there's one more area we need to cover: environmental record keeping. Now, for some of us, record keeping is about as exciting as having our wisdom teeth pulled or getting audited by the IRS. But it's going to happen one way or the other, so you might as well keep track.
But record keeping is a crucial part of staying in compliance with the regulations. It's also great insurance when the state or EPA inspector stops by. Let's go through the basic elements of a good environmental record-keeping system. First off, it should contain a complete updated copy of your state's CAFO regulations, as well as a copy of your state or federal permit if you have one, and any engineering reports and drainage surveys of your operation. It should also include a section that explains how you handle, store, and apply manure and lagoon water, with maps that display the fields you are using for land application. Keep a running tally of all manure that is removed. Indicate whether it's being hauled to one of your own fields or being removed by a third party. Also, keep a record of lagoon pumping activities and the amount removed each time. It's easy to keep track of if you have a meter on your pump, but if you don't, you can calculate the amount by multiplying the pump capacity by the amount of time you pumped. Create a section for lab test reports where you can insert results of soil, manure, and lagoon water tests. Depending on the operation, you might also need space for monitoring well data and compost tests. Document all lagoon-related activities, such as cleaning, liner repair, and inspection. And record maintenance activities related to equipment, including manure spreader repair and calibration, lagoon pumps, motors, and pivot systems. As we discussed earlier, your plan should have annual nutrient balance calculations for every field that you own or manage where manure or lagoon water is applied. That means keeping track of all manure, lagoon water, and fertilizer that is put on each field, and then figuring out the total amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients applied to fields. Update these records whenever you apply, and be sure to know what the agronomic target rate is for each field so that nutrients are not overapplied.
Well, every operation varies, so you may want to include some additional categories in your plan. If you need help getting started, there's plenty out there. Talk to your county agent, State Livestock Association, or an environmental consultant. The local USDA NRCS office also can provide assistance concerning the new regulations and the new cost share program that's available for the first time to CAFOs for environmental improvement. And there's nothing like getting your information directly from the horse's mouth. So don't hesitate to contact your state regulatory agency with specific compliance questions. Let's face it, government scrutiny of the cattle industry is not going away. And while it might be easier without the regulations, we all want a healthy environment to raise our families and the animals that we care for. With a solid environmental management plan and a little hard work, you can keep your operation on the proactive side of the fence instead of the reactive. You never know when a government inspector might stop by. But when he does, You won't be singing the blues. You'll be singing the cow-cow boogie.
Out on the plains down near Santa Fe, I met a cowboy walking the range one day, and as he jogged along, I heard him singing a most peculiar cowboy song. It was a ditty he learned in the city. Come-a-tie-yi-yi, come-a-tie-yip-li-yi.
Get along, get hip, little doggies, get along. Better be on your way, get along. Get hip, little doggies, and he trucked them on down the old fairway.
Singing his cow-cow boogie in the strangest way. Come-a-tie-yi-yi, come-a-tie-yippity-yi-yi. Singing his cowboy songs, he's just too much. He's got a knocked-out western accent with a hollow touch. He was raised on local wheat. He's what you call a swing half-breed, singing his cow-cow boogie in the strangest way. Come-a-tie-yi-yi, come-a-tie-yip.